Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, or good night, wherever you are watching this in the world. So, welcome to another SOS Podcast. Today is the podcast number 4. So, we're evolving in a space-time continuum here, as you can, if you've listened to the previous podcast. The podcast was about harnessing the power of time in the service of splendor, of course. Because it can be harnessed in the service of many different influences. So the last podcast was about time. Time goes with space, of course. The space-time continuum continues today in the podcast number 4. So today's subject is the sense of place. Sense of place. Well, the sense of place is actually the closest, or one of the closest, English translations of the word terroir, which is a French word which embodies kind of the concept of a sense of place. The fact that the sense of place expresses itself through a product. So today we're going to explore the notion that in the most splendid phenomena in this world, there is an exquisite reflection of the sense of place from which this phenomena springs forth. I hope you enjoy today's podcast. Sit back and enjoy. Thank you for all your contributions, your questions, and your comments. Enjoy. Bye-bye. So we're back now. And let's get ready to launch this 4th SOS podcast. Where are we going today? We're not going to an actual physical place. We're actually exploring the confines of time and space and their relation to human experience. What happened is in the podcast number 3, we explored the notion of time, and its title was Harnessing the Power of Time. And in this podcast, we're going to explore the notion of a sense of place. So in one flicker of the imagination, we're already there. So we're going to start this podcast with, I think, the most appropriate term. And this term is terroir. Terroir is a very popular term. Terroir is a notion that's more and more popular and widely used all around the world. It's from French, and it means the signature of the local ecosystem. Of course, the word is very, very difficult to translate, and there's no English synonym. So this is why this word is being very popular. It's actually a globe-trotting word. We can find it on all the 5 continents nowadays, mainly when one speaks of wine. However, terroir is not a notion that's strictly confined to wine at all. Often, the expression terroir in wine is mistakenly referred to as a specific kind of taste that one can perceive in wine. However, one can't say, oh, the wine has terroir. This wine has a lot of terroir. It's not the correct notion. Wine does not have terroir. Sure, the wine is a part of the terroir from which it sprung forth. However, a wine reflects or expresses its terroir. Various terroirs have various influences, and thus one refers to terroir as an actual specific geographical place. It's a geographical place in nature, and it's often a nature in which there's a symbiosis between humans and their environment. Terroir is at the crossroad between the objective and the subjective. It can be perceived and defined quite accurately, but never perfectly or exactly. The soil, the sun, the precipitations, the underground water, the local microflora, even the local ancestral production methods, and if you look at it closely, everything influences terroir. Even the patterns of the bee pollination are all factors having the effect of transferring the signature of the terroir to the fruits that it bears. So the notion of terroir is very interesting in today's world, because today, especially in North America, which is a relatively new society compared to everywhere else in the world, you can find a dichotomy, a big gap between the urban world and the natural world, which is often considered as wild nature. And anything in between is a gray area. Well, this gray area is the zone in which man interlinks with nature. And often there's a lot of excesses and a lot of pollution and a lot of damage is done. However, if you look at history, there's a lot of examples in which societies or villages live in very good symbiosis between their environment and their human activity. So to further reflect upon this notion, because it's not a strictly Western notion, this can be found in probably all cultures around the world to a certain extent. Of course, all cultures around the world have not gone to urbanization, although today it's almost all the cultures around the world have known urbanization. So there's this big paradox. When you go and study history, it's very interesting to see the deep roots that this notion of terroir has. It's a notion that's not always named terroir, but that is present in many, many different cultures. And it's very interesting to see some of the sources that you can find when you study history worldwide. In this case, the example I'm going to share with you is an even deeper notion of terroir. And for this, we have to go to Japan. So there's a wonderful source in the form of a 13th century manuscript written by Master Dogen. Dogen was a Japanese Zen master who studied in China, and he wrote some of the most important works of Zen Buddhism. He's actually the founder of the Soto school of Zen. I won't, of course, read this book for you. Well, it's not a book, it's more of a manuscript. But you should try to read this set of instructions, because the original manuscript is a set of instructions. It's not very widely available, but if you look for it, you can find there's a few books out there that are based on this manuscript that was written by Master Dogen. And you should read this book. It's a set of instructions to the chef. It's a timeless rule book masterpiece, and you can find actually I did some research, and you can find a link to it in the description below the video, and you just have to click on the link and it'll take you to somewhere where you can buy a book that was written and that is authentically based on this 13th century manuscript. And this manuscript is basically, as I just said, instructions to the Zen chef. I'm not going to read parts of the book as such. However, I'm going to give you an idea of the perspective of this manuscript, which stresses the proper state of mind when preparing any ingredient, regarding each and every ingredient as a palace. Because the status of a chef, not just his status, but the function of a chef, is of highest importance. Actually, each and every part of society is of highest importance. So when Dogen gave instructions to his chef, it's mind-boggling to see the complete perfection that's infused in his instructions. The chef should regard each and every ingredient that goes into the cuisine as a palace in itself. Even the most lowest quality ingredient should be treated as the highest value. In one chapter, it's noted that the cloud is related to the book that you're reading. So when the reader actually reads the book, he's reading a paper book made out of paper. This book is made out of paper. Actually, there's a bit of the cloud in this book. It's impossible there to extract the cloud from the book. However, the two are inextricably interlinked. You see, the cloud is an accumulation of water in the sky that at some point falls back to the earth in the form of rain. And this rain will nourish, obviously, many plants, many living beings, and some trees. And some of these trees have been used to make the paper, which made the book that the reader is reading at this moment. And so therefore, Dogen's way of thought stresses the interlinked quality of everything in the phenomenal world. When you read this book, there's a little bit of the cloud inside. This is analogous to the notion of terroir, where everything is interlinked. And when you drink this wine that was made in pure respect of the terroir, you're actually drinking the cloud as well. And you're drinking a part of the bee. And you're drinking a part of the work of the person who went to pick the grapes. You're tasting a bit of everything that went into this fruit that is presented to you in the form of wine. Now, of course, this is what happens in terroir in the world of wine, but this notion also applies to many other things, and not only edible things. It can also be applied to many other aspects of life. As we can see, terroir is actually inside all splendid works. We can see here it's part of wine. It's also part of cheese. You can find it in gastronomy in general. Sometimes gastronomy is made in such a way where you have no notion of terroir. And this can be very good gastronomy as well. It's nothing to look down upon. However, what we're talking about today is the notion of the sense of place. And this is a notion that's gaining a lot of ground in the gastronomical world today. There's molecular cuisine, which is done with the latest developments in technology, which was quite popular in the beginning of the 2000s, in that first decade there. But the terroir cuisine is now gaining humongous ground around the world. And this is because the terroir cuisine is the best way to make an emblematic gastronomy. So if you're in Oregon and you want to make an Oregonian cuisine, the best way to go is the terroir cuisine, because you're going to actually showcase the uniqueness of the staples that you can find locally. And also there's the notion of local consumption, consume locally. This is a very recent trend. However, it's probably a very durable trend, and I think it's here for quite some years. And if you take, for example, another country, in Denmark, there's the Noma, the very, very famous restaurant that in Denmark and Copenhagen was actually awarded the title of the world's best chef. And he argues for a terroir cuisine as well, because in today's globalized world, you can easily find the same culture everywhere. However, when one goes to a gastronomical Copenhagen restaurant, most people are actually trying to taste something unique, trying to taste something that makes the place, something that is actually the signature of the place. And in terroir cuisine, everything is about the uniqueness of the local foods. So you'll have many foods that have been picked in wild areas surrounding the restaurant in which it's made. And this current is just the best for gastronomical cuisines around the world, because you can end up having a unique product in any place you make, and it can really become part of tradition, because often Many experimentations are made, but when we're talking about terroir, once a very balanced discovery has been made in the gastronomical world, in the restaurant world, well, many times it's copied by other chefs, and it becomes kind of a local tradition. As we'll see, this is kind of the subject of today. Local traditions, they're quite rare, and this is why they're all the more precious. So this is for gastronomy, but you can also find terroir in visual art. Yes, indeed, visual art comes in many, many forms, and terroir is definitely not dominant in that field. However, it does exist. One of the very modest manifestations of this that I'm familiar with is the Charlevoix painters. Many of you probably heard of the G7 that was held recently in Canada in La Malbaie in the Charlevoix region of Quebec. And this region is a marvelously beautiful region. And there's the region is known for its topography because there was an ancient meteor impact. And that's what made what Charlevoix is today. There's a lot of difference between the surf and the turf, and the topography is unique. But what's really unique is the sky. It's world-renowned, and many, many different artists from many different countries, but a lot from Quebec, went to Charlevoix to study the light in the sky and on the topography that you can find in the Charlevoix region, mainly in the city of Bay St. Paul. That's one of the most popular ones with the Charlevoix painters. So there's one that even made... there's one that's considered one of the best. It's probably considered like the king or the patriarch of the Charlevoix painters. His name is Claude Lesauteur, Lesauteur. He's very well known in Canada and worldwide, actually. He died not too long ago in 2007. This man was a recluse, but his works were very unique and had this special aesthetic. And the aesthetic always incorporated the natural beauty of Charlevoix. And it was always present in his paintings. Although his paintings were not necessarily paintings of nature, his paintings were various situations in human life. However, there's always this infusion of the Charlevoix environment in it in a symbolic way. And it's very impressive to see that many other artists came up with the same kind of infusion in their own way. So the Charlevoix painters all have this more or less subtle influence of the topography and the light and the sky of Charlevoix, while continuing their discovery of their own aesthetics. So this is a field in which we can definitely say that there is terroir that is expressed through the Charlevoix painters. And this is one example. But of course, in visual arts, you can find many, many, many examples like this throughout the world. In literature, you can also have terroir. In France, there was this notion of terroir literature. In Quebec as well, we had what was known as it was a literary current. It's actually dead now, but it was called the terroir novel current. And basically, there were novels that were talking about the rural realities of life at the time, and they all had this special feel about it and this uniqueness to it, which made the people very, very avid readers of this kind of novel up until maybe the 60s. And recently there was another terroir novel that was discovered in a garage sale in the countryside, and that was very interesting to see. There was a new edition of terroir novels in 2014. But in a nutshell, the terroir novel literary tradition is steeped in basically the 40s. 1940s would be the peak of the terroir novels, and they make for something very unique, and it's very fascinating to look upon it today. In fact, you can find terroir in many great crafts all around the world. Of course, there's many great crafts which do not take into account the terroir factor, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. It can actually be a hindrance. The terroir notion can actually probably be a hindrance when doing mega projects or stuff like that. So terroir is a notion that comes only along in a specific kind of product, usually very high end and usually not very mass produced and difficult to find, which makes it relatively rare and all the more precious. Of course, many times it takes an aficionado to appreciate the terroir in some of the works. If you look, many buildings even have terroir in them. Of course, once again, in the North American context, it's not necessarily very easy to find this out. However, it is possible. If you look at many stoneworks, you can find out that many of the chateaus and the castles in England, in Germany, in France, and Italy have been built using stones from local quarries. So this means that the local quarries will give a unique color and a unique texture to the chateaus that are built right next to them. And this means that the chateaus are representatives of the region in which they are. They're representatives quite literally so, in the sense that they're built with the actual earth that surrounds them. This is often a detail that's overlooked, but it's one that's responsible for many of the architectural wonders that we can see. And often when we're talking about castles, there's many influences in castles. So when we can see that there's a local quality to the castle, it's all the more interesting. This subtle influence that the terroir can have in many great works. So when we talk about terroir, we talk about local products many times. However, there is also the phenomenon of exotic products. Many exotic products are very, very popular. Let's take, for example, Cuban cigars, which is a completely improvised example. Cuban cigars, when they are, well, now it's possible to get them in the States, but usually before, people used to come to Montreal to buy them because you couldn't get them in the States before. There was an embargo on Cuban products, but now you can get them in the States. So when you get a Cuban cigar, a very, very good Cuban cigar, you have an exotic product. So in that case, you don't have a local product. Can we still talk about terroir? Definitely, because this product was made with an intention of reflecting and even amplifying the terroir from which it sprung forth. Terroir in two ways. First, the tobacco leaf, which is grown in the best conditions. And second of all, terroir coming from the method of production from the Cuban cigar master that actually made the cigar with his own hands. One should not forget, terroir is at the intersection of the human being and its environment. So the human being, in this case, is part of nature. The actions done to realize this magnificent cigar are actually part of the local nature. So terroir is not only the specificity of nature, terroir is the specificity of nature, but considering that the human is part of nature, which obliges a terroir expressing product to be made by the human in a way that respects and takes into consideration all of the subtleties and the health of the nature from which it springs forth. So now we come into the crux of the subject. The subject is exploring the sense of place, and this sense of place is very much exemplified with geographical protections that are given to different products around the world. This exists in Asia, it exists in Africa, it exists in America, and most definitely in Europe as well. So these products are protected, taking into consideration the geographical, physical location from which they come. This linking the product to the earth from which it comes. Many of these traditions have organically come into existence over generations and generations. However, today, to see such a phenomenon is very, very rare because of the context, which is very different. So before, you could have Staffordshire cheese, or Roquefort cheese, or Cantal cheese, or Calvados, the famous apple spirit, or fantastic Lagavulin whiskey. So the situation today is that there's very strict hygienic regulations. For example, in Europe and in North America, the hygienic regulations many times keep the product from having too much of an influence of the terroir. So the hygienic regulations are often a financial burden for all of these companies that have to make their products with these new stricter and stricter regulations. In the North American context, this in the 70s, there was a first wave of hygienic regulations that we copied off the United States. And this, unfortunately, although it was not voluntary, but it was an involuntary consequence of these regulations. But we had to change everything in stainless steel vats when before we used different materials. And this led to the disappearance of the oldest cheese in North America, the cheese from the Orleans Island next to Quebec City. This cheese unfortunately disappeared. And if you look in the history of that Orleans Island, before, every village on that island, because it's quite a big island, every village used to make its own version of this cheese, this Orleans Island cheese. It was called in French la faisselle de l'île d'Orléans. And before, every village used to make their own version of this cheese. And as of the 1970s, 1980s, there was none of those cheeses available commercially at all. There was only a few families that continued the tradition in their own home for their own domestic consumption, but that tradition almost died out. This was a story that was very dear to my heart, and I remember one day having met the daughter of one of the last producers of this cheese from the Orleans Island, and it was quite an emotional moment to find out that her father, one of the last makers of this cheese, which was a tradition that would go back more than 400 years because it was a cheese that was made by the settlers in France, in their region, for centuries before that. So when they came to New France, they actually continued making the same cheese. So it was a cheese riddled with very, very deep tradition and history. And this man was the last maker of the cheese in North America. And I met his daughter, who told me that her father was actually very much alive and still continued to make the cheese. So at least it was very comforting to know that there was still a thread of this cheese that was continuing to exist through time. So as we can see, in the previous contexts, in the previous decades, the previous centuries, there were many traditions that were local traditions that appeared in an organic manner. Meaning, for example, a camembert cheese, for example, was made in one specific region, but by many different producers. This Orleans Island cheese was made by many different producers on the island. So there was many different versions of this cheese. They were all called the same, their cheese all had the same name because it was basically the same product. However, this product was made by many different companies. So you have this tradition in You can have this tradition in wine, you can have this tradition in many different food products, but you can also have this in handicraft. You can have this specific region in Iran where they make this specific type of carpet. And this specific type of carpet is related to this people that live in this piece of land that use these methods and that have been for centuries and generations. So in that case, many people make the same kind of carpet that has the same name. However, they're made by many different producers. In today's context, this is very difficult. Each venture today, when you open a company and you want to do a product, even if you want to reflect the terroir, which is quite difficult but nevertheless still possible, each venture, each little business wants to protect itself because they have enough financial burdens like that. They don't want anybody copying them. So the result is that there is no contemporary example of a locality or a village or a region where a new product is adopted or made by different local producers of the same kind of product. In other words, it's extremely rare and difficult to create a genuine new tradition in today's context. So of course there are new traditions in 2018, traditions that are related to a place or something. We can find different music scenes, for example, in different cities. Chicago has its own sound, and so do many other cities. But there is also viral phenomenon, but that's not exactly the same thing as a tradition, because a tradition is lasting through time. Usually, a tradition is something that has some kind of utility that is more than just mere entertainment. And of course, when it lasts through time, it becomes a tradition. The utility of a tradition can either be temporal or spiritual, but it's definitely something that has some use for society, and that's what makes it continue in time. And if it doesn't have a use, then it becomes folklore. And folklore is destined to die. Yeah, folklore is for museums, and it's nothing that's living. However, a tradition that's living, it has a utility, and this utility can either be temporal or material, or it can be kind of a spiritual tradition, which, as many can see, it's very difficult to have new ones today. But maybe there are some that we're not aware of because time hasn't passed yet in this very fast-paced context. So today, each business who makes a new product or new products want exclusivity of their own intellectual property. So if you want your own intellectual property and you launch a new product and it's this kind of new terroir shoe, you don't want somebody else copying you to make the same shoe. So many of the products have no link with the geographical location in which they're made. And this is all fine because the world needs all kind of different products. But today we're talking about products that take into consideration the sense of place. So unfortunately, the financial burden, the regulations, and the intellectual property considerations hinder new traditions from springing forth locally. There may be a few examples, but they're very rare, and one has to wish them well, because for them to survive is very difficult. So when one sees this kind of spontaneous and authentic product appearing, or company appearing, or individual doing a specific work, it's always very good, if the product, of course, is of quality, to encourage this company or individual to continue making this product, if the value, of course, is there. There's a few new traditions in the world that nevertheless can take form and that take into consideration the place where they're from, but usually it's not very, very local. It's more on a larger scale. Like, for example, There's Nollywood films. That's a modern tradition that is inextricably linked to Nigeria, has to do with Nigerian culture, and the result is a unique kind of film that you can't make in another place. You can make many things probably that look alike, but never the authentic thing. So Nollywood films, as an example, is something that takes into consideration the sense of place, and many different producers can actually make a film that will be referred to after as a Nollywood film. So this is one rare example. But here, again, we're in entertainment. So entertainment does serve a function, but when we look at other products that have a more utilitarian function, it's very, very scarce. Certain architectural trends can be found in Asia or other places around the world, and they have some kind of link with the sense of place. However, in this modern world, it's very rare, but when one finds one, it's all the more interesting to encourage this trend. Or actually, no, it's not a trend. It's more than a trend. It becomes a tradition through time. It's a good idea to encourage it. So we can think of the Scandinavian effect. The Scandinavian effect was felt through furniture designers, and these Scandinavian furniture designers actually were most probably influenced by the minimalism of the Nordic society in which they live, and maybe even the natural surroundings, which in winter gives a certain visual effect. And they probably found that there was a complementarity to the way they designed their furnitures and the natural beauty that surrounds them. So they made a very minimalist, very, very fluid, thin type of design. And one today can look at these various furniture designers and see quite clearly that this is a Scandinavian effect. This is a Scandinavian type of furniture. And often these designers are designers that make very, very high-end furniture that's using sometimes local ingredients, local woods, local materials, and making a very unique piece that's not mass produced and often has a very high value, and not only has a high sale value, but keeps its value through time. This is one of the very rare contemporary examples of a product that authentically takes into consideration the sense of place. I don't think we can say that there's terroir in the Scandinavian effect, but there definitely is something that is reminiscent of terroir. However, I think it's pretty safe to say that no specific new kind of product as such is made by different players in the same geographical location under the same name. This is because of the dichotomy that can be found between centralized and decentralized production. Of course, many people think that there is an opposition between local production and centralized production, but actually each and every one has their function. And in today's world, where the world population is quite high, of course the mass production is very, very important. It often it's predominant, and one can't criticize that. Of course, one can want mass production to be made in more ethical and more conscientious ways. However, there will always be the most authentic products, and the ones who take the most into consideration the sense of place and eventually terroir with the local productions. And often these are smaller productions, but of higher end and higher quality in many cases, although not in all cases. So in the end of this decade, the 2010 decade, local specialties related to a locality or place are definitely a rarity, and thus they must be protected, but most of all, encouraged. When we think about terroir reflecting products, or products made with an authentic intention of reflecting the sense of place, we realize that it's something happens within these products. If you go to Staffordshire, there's many different farms making Staffordshire cheese. However, they all make the same cheese. They all make the same cheese, but at the same time, each farm makes their own specific, unique version of Staffordshire cheese. So they all have a value. It's a paradox, which makes people be united by geography. And geography, or territory, becomes the common ground. And although there still may be competition, this territory unites the people that live on it together and make a common product. The territory actually becomes a common denominator for all the producers of Staffordshire cheese. So territory and sense of place can be the common ground that brings together different companies that are making a product while maintaining some form of competition. It's a very dynamically strong situation. And this is why, if ever, in your travels, in your researches, in your memories, you know of one of these products that are made in a specific place by different producers, but that make the same product that has the same name, I'd like for you to give me an example and tell me about it in the comments. And maybe we'll look into it and we'll integrate it to a further podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast dedicated to the sense of place. Let's get back together for the next podcast, which will be coming soon. And in this time, we'll be exploring the notion of the urban emigration that we can see in these recent years in the Western world. I'm Patrick Kasikian. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.